Well, I want to welcome you to our program today. I've got a very special guest. His name is Kevin Norin. He's a retired police sergeant from the Platteville Police Department. And so, Kevin, welcome and thank you so much for being on our program today.
Good to be here. Thanks.
We've got a very interesting subject that Kevin is going to be addressing today, and it is the arrest of Jesus. Okay, before we get into that, though, I just want to say, well, Kevin, you're retired now, but how many years did you serve on the Platteville Police Department?
I started with Platteville back in 1995. Worked there for 18 years, most of that time on patrol, but I also was a DARE officer, was assigned to the tactical team, did some drug work for a while. The part that I liked about my job the best was patrol. I liked being the first one on the scene to try and make things better.
I must say that our community was always very safe. I always say that I could go to bed at night and know I could just sleep tight, knowing that I was safe and secure because Kevin would be patrolling the neighborhood at night. And so I just always thank you, Kevin, for all of your good work and really appreciate it.
I was just one of 20 outstanding officers who work for the city of Platteville. Still do. They're doing a fantastic job, and I often use them as an example when I teach my classes at the university now in the criminal justice department.
Yeah, and I'd have to say the whole Platteville Police Department does just a wonderful job, and I appreciate all of them. It seems like whether it's something small or great, they really, they come and they do a great job. Yeah, well, you're retired, but you're teaching a class at the University of Platteville?
Yep, I've been teaching part-time there for several years. This semester I have 2 sections of evidence collection and processing. And the reality of the profession is this week's lesson plan is lived out in the news in the next couple of days. So it's very timely and it's very applicable to what's going on in the real world when I teach these young future CSI technicians and police officers.
Yeah, the Criminal Justice Department and program at the University of Platteville is considered to be one of the top in the country, isn't it?
Well, I have a lot of respect for what's done there. There's a good mix of academics as well as people like myself who have a bachelor's degree, but our advanced degree is in the School of Hard Knocks out there on the street actually applying what we learned.
Yeah, and so I imagine that's of great interest to the students as they are, not only learning the subject material out of the textbook, but also hearing it from somebody who has been there and done that many times.
They generally will give me feedback. They like the stories, the anecdotes that help support what's in the book. Most of them like that. I could probably just tell stories all hour long, but I'm required to get some coursework through too.
Yeah, imagine that makes the course very interesting.
I enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, how long have you been a Christian then?
Well, I was born and raised into the Lutheran Church. Went to Sunday school when I was growing up, got into high school and then into college. Like a lot of people that reach that point in their life, they kind of fell away from the church at that point. Actually became a lot of key things occurred in the seat of my squad car on patrol. I remember accepting Christ while on patrol in my squad, hearing on the radio, to say that you've done things that Jesus can't forgive is to sell God short. And that was an aha moment for me, that there was nothing I could do that I would not be forgiven for if I accepted Christ as my Savior. So that was the big step. Began going to church with the E-Free Community Evangelical Church in Platteville. My wife is a cradle Catholic. We've been going to Mass occasionally, and I love that we can serve and worship together as a couple, like we do everything else in our lives.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so when we think about now the arrest of Jesus, this comes up in all 4 of the Gospels, but I'm going to read from the Gospel of Luke. Why I'm reading this one, I don't know. I guess any of them would be interesting because they're all just a little bit different, but I'll read. And this is from Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 53. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and a man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of that." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." Okay, now I'm going to kind of ask you kind of a dubious question. I'm sure it would seem kind of odd, but you've made a lot of arrests.
I have.
Obviously, unfortunately, during your time, but that's your work.
Mm-hmm.
But you ever thought about if you were the police officer at Jesus' arrest?
It's interesting because the first time you asked me to speak on this was the first time I began researching the Gospels as an investigator. Because obviously we have no physical evidence of this incident. All that evidence is 2,000 years old. But we have testimonial evidence. We have 4 witnesses who provided their own versions, their own perception of what happened. And normally what we would do is we'd go testimonial evidence, people who saw what happened lead you to physical evidence, and then you confirm it with more testimonial evidence. Well, there's no physical. So we have to go by the stories of 4 people. Those 4 people each recounted the same event, but each of them observed and interpreted different things as important, and that's good. If you've got 4 witnesses who tell an identical story, word for word, my first thought is, well, they obviously cooked this up between the 2 of them, or between the 4 of them. But when you're talking about 4 witnesses and, everybody mentions the arrest, everybody mentions the disciple with the sword, but only one of them mentions Peter as being the guy. All right, that's what that person focused on. Another of the Gospels talks about when the rest of the disciples fled, one young guy wearing only a linen cloth took off naked. They tried to grab him and he ran away. It was probably Mark himself that was doing that. That seems to be the popular feeling about it. But what you're looking for is taking into account differences in perception, where the person was standing, what was important to them of this story. You look for common ground. Jesus was arrested by a large group of people. You had a mix of temple guards who were sent by the priests, and you had one of the Gospels refers to a cohort of Roman soldiers. Now, I Googled cohort. A cohort is a group of 300 to 600 soldiers. Keep in mind, too, that in those days, Roman army was the biggest, best armed, best trained army in the world. So you have 300 to 600 of these soldiers there to assist with the arrest. And you're looking at Jesus, a group of disciples. We don't know exactly how many of them they assume the 11 were there, but how many other people were there? What was the purpose of that show of force? And as far as the arrest goes, one of the many, many differences between a modern police arrest and the arrest that took place here, as a police officer, when I've taken away somebody's freedom, that's a big deal. When they feel those handcuffs go on, I have to know that I am legally in the right to do so.
So what all goes into an arrest? You can't just say, well, I don't like the looks of this guy on the sidewalk,
no,
so I'm going to go and stop and arrest him. There's got to be. What's the protocol for an arrest?
Right. Contrary to movies and television, there are a lot of things that have to take place before the decision to arrest somebody. The key step to placing handcuffs on somebody and taking away their freedom is probable cause. Probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed or is being committed. Without probable cause, you don't have a right to do a search warrant. You do not have a right to arrest a person. And that's something that is different in modern times versus the time of Jesus' arrest. When I was a police officer, when I first started back in '95, I didn't take an oath to swear to Governor Tommy Thompson or President Bill Clinton. I swore to uphold the Constitution. So every time there's been a new person holding those offices, I haven't had to swear a new oath. Now compare that to the soldiers and the temple guards. Soldiers in those days swore an oath to Caesar. So there was no, wait a minute, Caesar, what is my legal reason to be here? No. You follow the orders as long as you're going to be in the army. I'm guessing that the temple guards were much the same. They swore their oath to the priests.
So whatever they'd say is what they would do.
Priests say jump, they say how high. Yes.
Whereas for you, it's more aligning yourself with the Constitution then of the United States.
Yep.
Okay, so you got probable cause. And so then, now, like, can you just go and arrest somebody anywhere, or is there like some jurisdiction, or how does that go?
You know what, it depends on the situation. There needs to be jurisdiction, first of all. The two questions that a police officer has to ask, whether they're going to a barking dog call or serving a high-risk warrant, and I've done a few of each of those, is, do I have a legal right to be here, and do I have the resources necessary to do the job? If the answer is no, then I need to be asking, should I be proceeding? So for instance, what was the jurisdiction of the temple guards? Why did they choose that time and place? When we have a dangerous subject who needs to be arrested, a lot of times we'll choose a time of day and a location where the threat to the public is minimized, where we are less likely to use force, and if we use force, that there's less likely for the public to be injured. This showed signs of wanting to keep the arrest of Jesus out of the public eye. Keep in mind that these folks, all four Gospels mentioned that the crowd was acting on the authority of the temple priests and elders. So they were sent there probably to avoid a confrontation. The priests' big fear was that it would turn into a rebellion. And the priests were rightly afraid of the way the Romans were known to put down rebellions, which was brutally.
And not only, I mean, it would be bad enough under normal circumstances in Jerusalem, but the Passover was going on.
Right, town was full.
So the city would just swelled with population. And so if this is not done properly, you're looking at a huge uprising.
Right.
Lots of rioting and chaos, and then the Roman government or the Romans would have to bring in their their army and soldiers and to try to establish some semblance of peace.
And what I've gathered from reading about the Romans occupying that part of the world at that time is, provided the tax money came in and order was maintained, the people who lived there had a lot of autonomy. But if the Romans stepped in, the understanding was they were going to step in, and whatever the problem was going to be dealt with harshly. So, there was actually an idea that if the temple guards were to take out this one guy, Jesus, then that would save the lives of all the people who would lose it when the Romans would step in to crush a rebellion. So there's a lot of political stuff going on.
I mean, this was very methodical, wasn't it? I mean, it was very planned out.
Oh, yeah.
To make sure that, because they were, in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Kidron Valley there. So it was, away from the city proper, and it was also at night.
Right.
And
it was, I'm guessing that this was something they didn't want word spreading quickly through the city that this was happening, because Jesus had a large following. That probably from a security standpoint is not a bad idea. High risk stuff can be done, later at night in those areas where there's a good possibility of the officers being injured. In those days, I suspect that they wanted to keep it quiet. Where did they take Jesus right after he was arrested? They didn't take him to jail. They didn't take him to a court. They took him to the high priest's house. And that's where they had the trial. That's where Jesus was interrogated.
A place where they wouldn't expect.
Out of public view. Out of public, one of the things that we have in our judicial system is that we have open courts. If you are looking for entertainment, provided it isn't a juvenile case, you can go to Grant County Courthouse right now and walk in and listen in on whatever trials are taking place. It's open to the public. Things are reported on in the news. The Boston bombing trial is going on right now. That's being reported on every day. They have live feeds from people who were there. This was not that way. Everything was kept under wraps, under heavy guard. We don't see the Romans come back in again until Jesus is turned over to Pilate. So whether the Romans broke off and went back to their barracks, and this was now just a temple issue, we don't know. You know, it's a general outline of what occurred.
So, like you said, that the way society was back then and how it is now, as far as the whole judicial system and law enforcement, that it wasn't the same as how you would make an arrest. And I mean, as you look at this jurisdiction, well, everybody was kind of within their jurisdiction, but yet they really took orders from their superiors,
Right.
who would either be the high priest or Caesar.
Right.
But as far as probable cause, what are you looking for here?
What crime did Jesus commit? What crime did Jesus commit that made it so that rather than arresting him on the temple steps where he was teaching every day, that they had to do it under cover of darkness in the garden? This, I think, just from researching it in the last couple of weeks after you've asked me to do this, this is a political hit. This was an act to get a threat to the powers that be, both in the temple and the Roman government, under control. And they thought, if we get rid of this guy, then it's all going to blow over, just like all the other people who claimed to be the Messiah blew over. Of course, we know how that turned out 2,000 years later. Right.
This was the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know blasphemy was, what the religious authorities were accusing him of, that he claims to be the Messiah, the Son of God, but then again, it is what it is, or he is who he is. I mean, when you really are the Son of God, then, in their minds it's blasphemy, but Jesus is who he is, so it's still the truth. But then as far as the Romans go, well, Jesus claims to be a king. Or people are saying that he's a king, and so that poses a threat to their authority then.
Right.
And so, but I'm just kind of wondering, well, what do you see as being right about all of the arrest of Jesus? What was wrong? I mean, if you were to go back 2,000 years ago and put your uniform and your badge on and say, Kevin, we want you there, and we want you to be the key guy to make the arrest here. So what do you think? Well, I guess I'm operating in what is properly from a legal standpoint, but then other things to say, well, I think this is kind of shady here. I don't think, based on my own personal integrity and conscience, that I don't feel like I'm right in being here.
Well, the excuse, I was just following orders, did not play well at Nuremberg. And that's why police officers, as well as soldiers, have a responsibility to disobey an illegal order. If my sergeant, as a young officer, if my sergeant had come to me and said, hey, that guy there is trouble, take him in the alley and beat him up, obviously that's not something that I should legally do, and it would be my job to say, no, I'm not going to do that, and here's why, and report that supervisor for doing that. Of course, that never happened, but the idea is that every order has to be a lawful order. And if the laws of that day would go against my oath, nowadays my oath is to the Constitution, right? Taking away somebody's freedom in the United States is a big deal, and you have to have legal justification for doing it. It can't be, this is my badge, I'll do it because the badge says so. There has to be a legal reason to do that. I don't know. To put myself in that place, I guess I would probably identify more with the group of people in the garden with Jesus. What would I have done? Peter is compulsive. You read enough about Peter, and he was always, there was no filter between what he thought and what he said.
Sure.
When you get to the gospel that talks about Peter being the one drawing his weapon and cutting off the ear of the temple servant, I don't think anybody's really surprised that if it had to be somebody, it would be Peter. Would I have run? I don't know. I wasn't there. One of the issues that I have with my young students, and when I used to teach academy and was a field training officer, is people want to know the answer to every possible combination of variables on a situation. What would you do if? What would you have done if? And they get really tired of me saying, it depends on, it depends.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, speaking about Peter, he cut off the ear of the soldier and Jesus healed it. And you had already mentioned, that there were the temple police authority there. And then there was a cohort of soldiers.
Right.
I mean, there could have been anywhere, over 300, possibly over 600 soldiers here. And so it's almost like, Peter, think about what you're doing here. You got the sword. You're going to really take on all these people.
Yep.
But yet, Jesus was not going to establish his kingdom by force, but rather through the cross and through love. But,
he had his
but still,
mission.
why do you... So you look at all these soldiers there, and what do you suppose, wasn't it... It almost seems like it's superfluous, but why do you suppose that they wanted so many soldiers there as backup?
I don't know, but when I think of Peter drawing that sword, and he was probably an instant away from being killed by the temple guards and soldiers who were there. They were there to arrest somebody. This was an interesting part where they show up. Jesus said, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." He said, "I am he." And everybody, imagine a crowd of over 600 people falling to the ground. "I am he," and they all fall.
Yeah.
And yet, they stood up again and continued with the arrest. How does that not show demonic influence? That's evil at work. The idea that Peter drew his weapon and actually struck one of the slaves, why were there not a dozen swords stuck in him an instant later? Well, Jesus stepped in that split second, said, "Put your sword away or you're going to be killed." That's pretty much what he said. And at that point, shortly after then, Jesus gave himself over to be arrested. He submitted, because he tells in one of the Gospels, "Could I not call down 10 legions, pray to my Father, and have him call down 10 legions of angels?" One angel would have been enough. But there was a mission that Jesus had to do, and that meant putting Peter in his place again to carry out that mission. And thank God for us that he did.
Yeah. And so when we look at, a whole army there, and then you got, of course, Jesus could have called upon, heaven's army of angels, but, that would have saved Jesus. But I'm wondering if, this whole idea of Jesus being the Messiah and how they understood the Messiah to be, that basically you got King David, this is going to be the next King David who's going to run out with authority everybody and is going to establish this new kingdom where, once again, Israel reigns and everybody. That I'm almost wondering if they thought, well, if Jesus is who we think the Messiah, as far as the Messiah goes, and somewhere along the line here, an army's going to show up, and this would be the time.
Right. Well, these soldiers and temple guards weren't living in a vacuum. I'm sure they had heard stories of Jesus' miracles and Jesus' power manifested. And Jesus himself sat on the temple steps and made a whip, braided a whip, and drove everybody out of the temple. That is an example of righteous violence. I'm sure that there was a little case of nerves there among them, saying, what's going to happen? What's going to happen when we actually confront this guy? What if he really is the Son of God? I'm guessing that there was fear in the hearts of a lot of people.
That having a lot of soldiers there was needed then. I mean, whether it's this army's going to show up or Jesus with all these powers could knock us all, of course, they all were knocked down. But then you just don't know if the people in the streets get wind of this, that they're all going to end up going down there and have a big riot. But then now another person, we were talking about Peter, but the other one is Judas. Judas, he's always kind of the devil incarnate, and that's how he's always viewed. But how do you see his role in this whole thing with the arrest? He's the one that brought them down, saying, well, this is where Jesus hangs out. There he is, and he kissed Jesus.
This is my opinion. I'm going to sit on my opinion box for just a minute. I think Judas probably wanted the fighting king on a war horse at the head of his armies. He wanted David incarnate. And I think that he could have helped Jesus. This is in his own mind. If I provoke Jesus, to actually start this revolution, then the fight will be on and Israel will be free. I think he was trying to do God's job. And how many people have run up against resistance trying to do God's job when they should be doing their own job?
Yeah.
I think he is a tragic figure. I'm sure that he was under the influence of evil with a capital E, but I don't think he was necessarily, I think he was a political figure. He was trying to create a political outcome. Mm-hmm. And that showed his lack of belief too. He really never knew who Jesus was. Mm-hmm. I can make Jesus do stuff. That's a flawed argument right there.
So Judas was kind of forcing Jesus' hand, God's hand at this point, saying, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to take care of matters. And that's always the temptation that we have in our lives with God. And
sure.
But then, okay, so Jesus is arrested. He is now in the authority and the control. In a sense, his freedom has been taken away. Mm-hmm. But isn't this the whole idea here, is that Jesus is arrested for humanity's sake, being bound now by our sin as he goes onto the cross, that we can be free.
Everything that happened, including Judas' betrayal, was to allow Jesus to carry out his mission of salvation for us. If any of those things had not occurred, if the soldiers had fled after they had all hit the ground, or if Peter had been killed along with all the disciples, so many different things. If Judas had not gone to the temple priest and said, tonight's the night, you can take him, then how would that mission have turned out? It all played out according to God's will.
It all fits into that plan. And, well, I'll tell you what, Kevin, this has been just so interesting to hear you talk about this. Somebody who is a strong Christian and a former police sergeant talking about the arrest of Jesus. It just is so interesting, so fascinating. But I just think about all of what Jesus went through for us so that we are no longer captive to our sin, but rather we are now free to be God's people. So, Kevin, thank you so much for being on the program today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this day as well.